In this lesson, we'll learn how we can use the V-Ray MultiMatte render element. Alright, so whenever rendering our images, it's really always a good idea to try to render these in a way that is going to give us quite a bit of freedom to make adjustments, whatever those may be, in some kind of a post-process application. So something like After Effects, Photoshop, Composite, whatever the case may be. So if we want to be able to come in and make things like minor color corrections, minor color tweaks, minor lighting adjustments to only certain portions of our image, what we want to try to do is create some kind of a mask for those particular areas. So that way we don't necessarily have to come in and meticulously and tediously mask around certain areas if that's the only area we want to adjust in post. So one method of doing that inside of V-Ray is to take advantage of what's called a multi-matte render pass, or a render element, I should say. So let's come in and take a look at a couple of different ways of doing that. One is to actually apply a multi-matte identifier to the material itself. So if I have a V-Ray material, and let's go ahead and take a look at the output connection so we can actually get to the shading group of this material. Now with this active, let's go ahead and go into Attributes, V-Ray, and turn on Material ID. So you can see now we have access to the extra V-Ray attributes. If we go ahead and pull this down, we have now the ability to access this multi-matte ID. Now, we actually do have a separate lesson for the material ID, so we actually do discuss this in one of our other lessons. For now, we're just going to focus on the multi-matte ID. So let's come in, and I'll just set this multi-matte to 1. All right, and we'll talk a little bit more about just what this means here in just a moment. But I'm going to take a couple of other materials, and we'll do the exact same thing. So I'll grab this blue material, take a look at its output connections, and adjust the multi-matte. Now, one thing you're going to want to be aware of is that currently within Maya, we actually run into a little bit of a refresh issue where it looks like on this blue material, there is actually a material ID and a multi-matte ID already active. But if you take a look at the attributes, there is actually no material ID active. So what we're seeing right here is actually not this material's ID. This is really just kind of a refresh issue. So to fix this, just bounce back over to the material itself and then back to the shading group. And now you can see that it has updated and we no longer have that option. So now we can properly add this material ID again. And for this multi-matte, I'll set it to 2. So remember, this was 1. This will now be 2. For this green one, we'll set it to 3. So again, taking into account this refresh issue that we are probably going to run into, when you go back to your new material shading group, just bounce back to the material, back to the shading group, and now our material ID is gone, just as it should be. So now let's properly add the material ID to this new green material, and we'll set its multi-matte to 3. So again, 1, 2, and 3. Now let's bounce over into the render settings, and in the V-Ray, let's go over into the render elements tab, and let's enable this multi-matte. So double click on this. Let's move this over to the side. If we go into the multi-matte render elements, just simply select this, and we can now make some adjustments here in the attributes. So we can essentially start to assign different objects to different portions of the red, green, and blue channel. So in the red object ID, we'll set that to 1. Green material, we'll set it to 2. And blue, we'll set it to 3. So now the objects that I had set to 1 should now be stored in this red object ID. The materials that I set to the material ID of 2 should be stored in green, and the ones that I set to 3 should now be stored in blue. Now, here's something that is important in this case. We actually don't have a proper material, or rather an object ID selected. Instead, we're using the material IDs, or the object IDs that were found on the material itself. Okay, so for that reason, we need to make sure that whenever we go into this, that we have the Use Material IDs option active. So now, if we actually want to see this, let's go over to the V-Ray Common tab. And what I like to do whenever viewing these render elements is to turn on the V-Ray frame buffer. So I'll turn this option on, and now whenever I render this image out, instead of rendering this into Maya's render view, it's now going to render this into V-Ray's frame buffer. Alright, so once this is finished, we can now see the actual RGB color. And if we pull this menu down, we can also view any render elements that we had active. So here's our multi-matte that we had active. And now you can start to see some of these different areas. So if I were to take a look at just the blue channel, we can see only these objects that we had assigned to that multi-matte ID of 3. right? Same with the green and the blue. So by essentially taking this multi-matte render element as a separate pass, we can now just simply start to key out certain channels. So if I simply key out the red channel, I now have a perfect key or a mask around these particular elements. So now with that mask in our post-processing application or our compositing application, it now becomes very easy to just simply use this as a mask and now make color corrections to this one particular area of our image. Right? And the same holds true for areas that are in the blue or the green channel. So just simply keying out the blue channel now easily pulls out these objects that I can now come in and make color corrections to just those objects. So because we are only limited to being able to access 3 different channels in this multi-matte, we really don't have the option to contain every single one of our objects in this separated multi-matte. So again, because we are sort of limited to that, what we could do is just simply go back to our render settings, go back to our render elements, and add in a new multi-matte. So for this one, let's say now we wanted to start assigning multi-mattes to new objects. So if we come back in here, go back to the shading group of, let's say, this yellow material, which, again, if you recall, this was material ID 1, 2, and 3. So if we go back over here, we could set this one to be 4. So again, making sure we update this. Material ID, multi-matte of 4. We can go into this pink one. And again, we'll set its multi-matte to something like 5. There we are. And now, in this new multi-matte, we can go through the same process. So, turn on Use Material IDs. And the red object, we'll set that to Material ID 4. And this one can be 5. So now when I re-render this back out, you can see again, back in the RGB, we have our multi-matte that has these 3 different channels of elements separated out. And if we take a look at multi-matte 1, you can see now we have on a separate multi-matte these different elements that are separated. So for as many elements as we have in our scene split across these 3 different channels, if we have more than what we can be contained in one multi-matte, we can just set up as many multi-mattes as we want in order to contain as many of these different passes and as many objects as we want. Now, at the moment, we are using this to refer to material IDs. So here in the material itself. Now, if we wanted to, we could actually take individual objects and actually assign objects to a certain multi-matte regardless of what material they have. So let's say, for example, if I were to select all of these different spheres, I'll just Control, click, and drag to deselect a few of these options. So I just have these spheres selected. Now, what I could do is with all of these, let's go in and create a single object property node and assign that to all of these objects. So now if I select all of these, go into the object properties, I do have the ability to drop in an object ID, or if I wanted to, I could just simply grab the object itself and apply a specific object ID just to that one particular object. But if I wanted to, we could now come in and let's say I wanted to give this an object ID of something like 1. And now, if I wanted, I could create another new multi-matte, and in the red channel, set the object ID to 1, and we'll disable this Use Material ID, so that way it will now use the object instead of the actual material itself. So now re-render back into the frame buffer. And you can see that once this render completes, if I were to take a look at this new multi-matte that I had just generated, you can see here's all of these object ID objects that I had set to a value of 1, and I had set those to be rendered inside of this red channel. All right, so overall, a really, really powerful, very, very versatile way of being able to split all the different objects apart in our scene and being able to quickly and easily mask out specific areas so that we can start to perform color correction operations and things like that in post. So that's a look at how we can utilize this multi-matte render element in V-Ray for Maya.